Hi guys, maayong adlaw sa tanan and I am Sir Jessaroy Alcaraz. And today we will be learning about basic accounting for service entities. So I'm making this series, okay, video series in order for students and non-students to understand, to have a better understanding kung unsa ning accounting process. Okay? Ikan sa sugod hantod sa pinaka katapusan because I noticed that there are a lot of students nga nagalisod pagsabot sa basic accounting, when to debit, when to credit, when to use assets, when to use expenses, when to use liability, and when to use sorry, expenses, something like that. And there are also, no, unfortunately, there are also teachers na although they know and understand the entire accounting process, but sometimes they fail to pass on the learning, the understanding of basic accounting. Maunang, there are a lot, dagang students nga nagalisod. And the thing about accounting and basic accounting specifically is this is your foundation for the higher accounting. Okay? Kung sa basic accounting pa lang, dili nakakasabot. Okay? Maglisod yung pagsabot sa financial accounting, management accounting, managerial accounting, advanced accounting, maglisod juga. Okay? That is why I'm making this series to hopefully to help students and non-students sa ilahang mga academic needs, ilang business needs, and possibly professional needs po. Okay? Without further ado, and wala edit-edit, okay, wala nang edit-edit, no? Let's go over to the discussion. So allow me to share my screen. Okay. First things first, the accounting cycle. So the accounting cycle, depende sa author ng inyong matanawan, have the following parts. It starts with the transaction, the financial transaction, going into the journal entries, then summarizing them, and a ledger posting, trial balance, worksheet, adjusting entries, which is for a lot of students, including me, isa ni siya sa mga pinakalisod na topic sa basic accounting, financial statements, and then closing of the books. So, for this video, we'll be discussing transactions and journal entries. So, we have material here that I found online, Accounting Process for Service Entity by Chair Jace. I don't know kung kinsa si Chair Jace, who is in an LPT, licensed professional teacher, and also a certified bookkeeper. But whoever you are, thank you so much for this material, and di na ta makapananghid no kay tuwa na gigamit. But nevertheless, thank you no kung sa mga audience, kung kaila mo kay Chair Jace, please do extend our gratitude, and then inform na to si ma'am or si sir nga gigamit na to iyahang material. Okay. So first things first, accounting is a service activity. Okay? So accountants, bookkeepers offer a service activity. Its main function is to provide quantitative information, primarily financial in nature, about economic entities that is intended to be useful in making economic decisions. Basically, accountants, bookkeepers, well, bookkeepers are the ones who usually make the records, and accountants are the one analyzing the records. So they work hand in hand to provide a service sa mga users so that the users, whether internal or external ba na sila, can make financial decisions, relevant financial decisions para sa ilahang business. Usually, sa ilahang personal finance or para sa ilahang mga employers. So that the goal is to make profit, increase our sales, and basically to become better managers of money. So, in accounting, we have 5 financial elements. Number 1 are the asset. So, unsa man yung assets, sir? Assets are basically resources controlled by the entity. So, these are the things that the business owns na ginagamit nila para sa ilahang business. Na kwarta, receivables, supplies, inventory, land, vehicle, equipment, building. So tanan gamit, tanan mga kabutangan, tangible and non-tangible. tangible and intangibles that helps them make future economic benefit. So kung naninda ka, mo ni siya ang imuhang mga tinda. Liabilities are present obligations of the entity. Basically, the utang. Okay? So utang. And then equity, residual interest in the asset. Okay, this is quite tricky, no? But to help us explain this one, kailangan na to ng accounting equation. So this is the accounting equation. Okay? By the way, there are two equations na dapat ma-familiarize ninyo. The first one is the accounting equation, which states that total assets is always equals to liability plus equity. And the second equation is that debit is always equal to credit. So, pag ani mo guna siya, sa business man good, natay mga kabutangan. These are the assets. Okay? So, muna to siya, cash, accounts receivable, supplies, inventory, land, building, blah, blah, blah. So, kaning nga mga properties, kaning mga butangan naa na siya corresponding owners. Okay? Naa na siya corresponding owners. Although nakapangalan na siya ng mga properties sa business. Okay? Although nakapangalan na siya ng mga properties sa business. Ang tag-iya jud ana kay duha lang. It's either the creditors or the owners or investors. Again, kani nga mga assets, katong daghan nga mga assets, yung panag-iyahan yun na siya sa creditors o mga owners or investors. So, if ang tag-iyaan ang mga property kay ang creditor, buot pasabot ana, kana nga mga property, kana nga kwarta, kana nga building, kana nga equipment, inutang na siya. That is why kaning asset inutang is also under the ownership of a creditor. That is why it's a liability. So kaning asset inutang, that is why it's a liability. Okay. There are also assets. Okay? There are also assets nga para sa mga tag-iya. Okay? Para sa mga tag-iya. Either the owners or the shareholders or the stockholders or the investors. Okay? So, kani nga mga assets, remember, like creditor. Kani nga mga assets, na-portion ani nga creditor ang tag-iya. Liabilities. Naapoy portion ani ng mga assets, owners ang tag-iya. Okay? Equity. So again, utang, liabilities, equity, owners. So hopefully nasabtan to siya. Kung wala, feel free to ask me sa comment section. Okay, we also have, so kaning siyang tulo, assets, liabilities, and equity, these are the elements found in the balance sheet. Okay, so kung saan ang balance sheet, sunod na lang. We also have income and expenses that can be found in the income statement. It tells whether or not the business is profitable or not. Okay? So income is the increase in economic benefits in the form of inflows of assets or decreases in liability. Actually, this definition is quite vague. No? Medyo vague ni siya nga definition. But the best definition that I can give you para mas masabtan ninyo siya is that income are the inflow of money, okay, the inflow of assets from our activities, okay, from our operation. So kung nagapamiligya ta og maruya, okay, every time nga mahalinan tag maruya, or if barber shop ta and every time mutopi ta, and then naay ihatag nga bayad ang atong customers, that is our income. And expenses naman, these are decreases in economic benefit during the accounting period. So this represents outflow of assets or increase in liability. Medyo ano po dyan, no? Medyo lisod po siya medyo lisod siya sabtot. But sa inato na lang, no, nga explanation, expenses are the opposite of income. So, expenses na siya if we are paying for something. Okay? Kung magbayad ta og sweldo, magbayad ta og renta, magbayad ta og plete. So, those are expenses. And kaning mga expenses, gina-deduct nato ni siya sa income. And if ever positive na siya, then we make a profit. But if our expenses is greater than income, then muna siya ginatawag na lugi. Okay. So, I have already discussed assets and liabilities. Okay, let's now go to the debit and credit. Understanding debit and credit. I hope you listen well. I hope you listen well because this is very crucial. Debit and credit is one of the topics na daghan kay mga estudyante nga malibog. And kani, before we proceed, I want you to forget the definitions nga gihatag sa inyong teachers. Nga naman, because the most common, the common definition nga ginahatag sa mga accounting teachers sa debit and credit is pag debit daw, the value received, and pag credit daw, the value parted with. Okay? Pag debit daw, positive daw na siya, increase. Okay? Pag credit daw, decrease. Okay? Well, to some extent, tama man na siya. But not all the time. That is why, para mas mapadali ang atong kinabuhi, kalimti na lang sana. Okay? I-set aside sana, isulod sana sa kahon niya, balikin na lang after na ako siya ma-discuss sa inyo. So, hopefully, i-set aside na ninyo. Okay, sige, ganito. Debit and credit does not have meaning on their own. Okay, balik ko na ako ha. Siguro mali dyan siya, no? If we go if we go very strict sa definition sa debit and credit, but para mapadali atong mga kinabuhi, una-unaan na lang that debit and credit does not have any meaning and relevance on their own. So wala na sila meaning. Okay? So kanus lang na sila magka-meaning. Magka-meaning na sila, magka-relevance na sila if we attach them or connect them to an account title. Okay? Remember na atay 5 general elements of financial statements. Assets, liability, equity, then income and expenses. But for purposes of journal entry, 6 na ni sila. Okay? So, again, debit credit, wala meaning, magka-meaning na sila if we identify first the accounts. So, what are these accounts? The asset, liability, capital, withdrawals, revenue, and expenses. Okay? So, to help you memorize them, so natay mnemonics, dealer. Okay? Dealer. D-E-A-L-E-R. What does this mean? It means that on the left side, sa debit side, we have 3. Drawings, expenses, and assets. And on the right side, we have liabilities, equity, and revenue for the credit. So, unsa may relevance ani? Sige, I'll explain. Kaning na-address sa left side, kaning drawings, expenses, and assets. Take note that they are under debit. What does this mean? It means that kaning mga accounts, these are increased by debit. Okay? Masabtan na ninyo later, but for now, you just have to remember that kaning tulo ka accounts are increased by debit. Their normal balance kay debit. Sige? So if we, for example, if we try to increase, if there is an increase in asset, we debit it. But the opposite is also true. If there is a decrease in asset, kailangan ta mag-credit. Okay. Ito na po ta deres pikas. Sa credit side, we have LER, liabilities, equity or capital, then revenue or income. This means that when we increase liability, kaya pag magdungag tag liability, let's say makautang ta, we credit an liability account. If you remember, accounts payable increases if mangutang ta. So pag mangutang ta, there's an increase in accounts payable. Accounts payable, when increased, is credited. Okay, ano naman? Because the rule states that it's a credit. The normal balance of liability, equity, and revenue are all credit. But if, let's say, magbayad ta og utang, pag magbayad tag utang, be reminded na mabawasan ang atong liability, we debit liability. Okay? Now, So hopefully that's clear. But if not, feel free to ask a question. So how do we make a journal entry? 5 steps. Number 1, analyze the transaction. Basahin mo muna ano ang nangyari sa transaction. And then take note. This is important. As accountants, as bookkeeper, it is important to answer the question para kay kinsa ta nag-record. Okay? Ngano man? Nganong importante man na, sir? Because for every transaction, there are 2 parties involved. Okay? There are two parties involved. For example, mupalit. Okay? Mupalit taog maruya. Kita ang nipalit ha, kita ang nipalit. Sa ato ang part nga buyer, nagpagawas taog kwarta. Okay? Take note ha, ang kwarta nigawas sa ato kay nipalit man ta. But on the other side of the transaction, ang kwarta nisulod sa namaligyag maruya. Sa buyer, nigawas ang kwarta, na seller, nisulod ang kwarta. That is why it is important to know which side of the transaction are we recording for. So, kay kinsa man nga side? The answer is sa business nga side. Always bear that in mind that when we do records, we are recording in behalf of the business, not the owner, not the clients, not our suppliers, not the government, not the banks, but our business. We are recording on behalf of our business. So that's number 1. Number 2, after analyzing what happened, you have to identify unsa nga mga accounts ang affected sa katunga transaction. Na involved ba ang cash, involved ba ang capital, involved ba ang liability, involved ba ang income, involved ba ang expenses. So identify. Okay, the accounts affected. Number 3, after identifying the accounts, you have to determine if katong account that was affected increased or decreased. So again, after identifying what are the accounts affected, determine if nagtaas ba siya or nagbaba. Number 4, then you can now make your journal entry, and after which you write your explanation. Okay, so we have some examples. So let's say the transaction. Okay, let us assume that Mr. Lee will open Lee Services. Mr. Lee is the owner and the business is Lee Services. In accounting again, as part of our assumption, we separate the owner and the business. Okay, this is what we call the accounting entity assumption. Let us look at the inflow and outflow of different elements of finances in the tabular analysis. Okay, number 1. The first transaction is the owner invested 10,000 cash to open Lee Services. Okay, analyze. Number 1, analyze. What happened? Si owner daw, natag-iya, invested. Nagpasok ng 100,000 pesos sa iyang business. So this is the owner, this is the owner, this is the business. The cash went from the owner into the business. So yun yung nangyari. Number 2, what are the accounts affected? Actually, the accounts affected kay cash and then capital. Sir, okay, siguro cash, kabalo na mo that cash is affected. Bakit? Because it involves 100,000 cash. But sir, nganong na ay capital affected? Nganong affected ang capital? Because always remember, let's go back to the accounting equation. Assets. May nagpasok ng assets. Okay? And sabi ko, on the other side, kinsay tag-iya. Okay? Kaning asset nga ni sulod, kay kinsa man eh. Okay? In our example, it came from the owner. So since it came from the owner, it formed part of our equity. Okay? And under equity, na atay ginatawag nga capital. Okay? So wala na to na-discuss din no, on chart of accounts. But in another video, we can just discuss chart of accounts. Basically, chart of accounts is just a list of accounts na ginagamit sa business. So identify lang mo dito. asa nga unsa nga mga accounts ang under sa mga elements. So in this case, cash, which is an asset, and then capital, which is a capital, 10,000. Okay, number 4. Number 4 ba? Number 3. Is there an increase or decrease? Take note. Cash. What happened to cash? Kaya kinsa ganit na nag-record in behalf of the business. So question. Si business, nadungagan yung kwarta or nabawasan? Yes. Nadungagan. Ganun nadungagan ba? Because the owner invested money sa iyahang business. So the business received money. So ang cash, nadungagan. And what about capital? So remember that capital is the portion nga invested by the owner. So, nadungagan ba or nabawasan ang gi-invest sa owner? The answer is yes, nadungagan. Okay? So, kay nadungagan man, then 100,000 ang nadungang for Lee Capital. Let's now make a journal entry. Okay? Ito tayo. So, cash, particulars, debit, okay? So, cash and then Lee Capital. What happened to cash? Cash increased. Okay, according sa tong kodigo, cash is an asset. And then, nadungagan daw siya. Therefore, it should be debited. 100,000 pesos. Debit. 100,000 pesos. And then, since it came from the owner, Lee Capital also increased. Anong sabi sa kodigo natin? Equity, increase, credit. So, 100,000 pesos. Then, explanation to record. Okay. Let's now go to the second transaction. Bought supplies worth 8,500 in cash. So what happened? Kita, business ta. We purchased supplies. Nagpalit ta. Nagpagawas ta og 8,500 nga kwarta in exchange for supplies of 8,500 pod. So, the accounts affected, supplies and then cash. Nagpagawas og kwarta, decrease. Nagdungagan ang supplies kaya nagpalita, increase. Okay? So let's now make a transaction. Cash, supplies, and then cash. Cash, nadungagan. Ay, ang supplies, nadungagan. Supplies is an asset. Okay? Supplies is an asset. Supplies, asset. So kay asset man na siya, pag madungagan na siya, we debit. Ayan, debit. 8,300. And then cash. What happened to cash? Since nagbayad daw cash, nabawasan na itong cash. That is why naka-parenthesis na siya. In accounting, pag makita gani mong naka-parenthesis, it means it is a deduction. Sir, nga nung nabawasan? Kasi nga, bumili tayo. Nagbayad tayo ng cash, 8,500. So, cash is an asset and then nabawasan, credit. 8,000. Okay, record purchase. Okay, next transaction. The business bought equipment on account amounting to 50,000 pesos. Nagpalit ta og equipment. And then, sa pagpalit na to, gibayaran ba na to o wala? The answer is, wala na to bayari. Ato ang utang. Sa ato pa, the accounts affected are utang and then equipment. Kasi bumili tayo ng equipment pero unutang natin. So, equipment and then the appropriate account under liability is accounts payable. So, equipment and then accounts payable. How much? 50,000 pesos. So, equipment, nadungagan. Equipment is an asset. Since nadungagan siya, we makalimot ko sa na-repermenting kameron. Since nadungagan siya, it is a debit. And what about accounts payable? Nadungagan bang atong utang? The answer is yes. Utang is a liability and then pag madungagan siya, it is a credit. So ito na lang ni ano, Bit. Tungan na lang natin sa color coding para di mo malibon. Ayan. So, dungagan, credit. Another 50,000. Purchase of equipment on account. Equipment. Next, transaction. Ayan. Borrowed money from the bank, 15,000 with a written note of promise to pay. So, nakadawat taog 15,000 pesos cash. Asa gikan? Sa bangko. Gi-utang na to. Okay? So, there is an increase of cash kasi meron tayong natanggap. And there is also an increase in liability kasi nga umutang tayo sa bangko. But, instead of putting it sa accounts payable, we're using notes payable. Bakit? Kasi it indicated that there is a written note of promise. So, in accounting, if there is a promissory note, we record notes payable instead of accounts payable. 15,000 pesos. So cash and then notes payable. Nadungagan ang cash. Cash is an asset, therefore it should be debited. Nadungagan po ang ato ang utang. Notes payable is an utang, liability, and if madungagan na siya, we credit it. To record borrowing from bank. Okay. Next transaction. Paid half of the price of the equipment. Take note, in transaction number 3, na atay utang nga 15,000. In our transaction number 5, nagbayad na raw ta. Pero, katunga lang. Since nagbayad ta, there is an outflow of cash. Cash decreased. Okay? And what about our utang? Di ba natin utang nga 50 mil? Nagbayad daw tag katunga. So, sa'yo nahitabo sa atong utang? Nadungagan or nabawasan? Yes, the answer is nabawasan ang atuang utang. So, since nabawasan man ang atong utang, is that a debit or credit? Okay? Utang daw, utang. Nabawasan. So, debit. Accounts payable, 25,000. And cash, nabawasan din. Since this is an asset, it should be credited. So, record payment. Accounts payable. Okay, next transaction. Hey, apit na tamahuman. Purchase additional supplies on account. So, umutang tayo ng supplies. Supplies is an asset, and then, since nangutang ta, there is an increase in supplies, then accounts payable. 3,000 pesos, 10,000 pesos. Supplies is an asset, and when we increase assets, we debit. And accounts payable, nangutang ta, we also credit. So, record, purchase, supplies. Okay, next. The owner withdrew an amount. Okay, now we make use of drawings here. The owner withdrew an amount of 10,000 pesos per personal use. Pag makakita gani mo nga the owner, okay, took away assets, usually in the form of cash, from the business for personal use. Okay, take note ha. For personal use, that is a reduction sa iyahang capital. Okay, that is a reduction of the equity. Mabitaw na siya nakabutang sa daw, minus. But instead of reducing, di ba pag mag-reduce tao capital kay debit man, instead of using capital, we temporarily use drawings. Okay? The drawings. Okay, ito sa to ang kodigo. Our kodigo states that drawings, when increased, is debited. Nadungagan ang gikuha sa owner for personal use. Since nadungagan man, with debit drawing. Kung sa iyang ikuha, cash. Therefore, cash was reduced by 10,000 pesos. Okay, kulang 0. And then, 10,000 pesos na leave drawings. Okay? To record withdraw. Okay? While, double check na ito. Okay. Sige. Next transaction is, okay, rendered services. Ayan na. We are already dealing with our clients. We have rendered a service and received cash amounting to 15,000 pesos. Accounts affected kay cash and then revenue or income. Okay? Sir, nakabutang lagi diri sir kay plus diri sa capital. Okay, that's actually true kasi when we receive revenue, when our revenue is increased, later on, capital of the owner also increases. But instead of using capital, instead, di ba, nadungagan man ang capital, instead of crediting capital, we credit service revenue. Cash and then service revenue. How much? Cash was increased, therefore debit, 15,000 pesos. Diba? Yes. And service revenue, record receipt of money for service revenue. Okay. Next. Happen. Rendered services on account. Okay. Nag-rendered taog service. Pero wala tama bayaran. So, naay utang. Okay? Ang atoang customer naay utang sa atoa. Naatay kolektahonon. And kolektahonon in accounting is what you call accounts receivable. Okay? So instead of receiving cash, we have actually received accounts receivable. Receivable. And then service revenue. Accounts receivable increased kay nadungagan man ato ang singlunon. So nadungagan siya by 17,000 pesos. And asagikan ang 17,000 pesos, it came from the rendering of service. Therefore, service revenue. So record service rendered. Okay. Next transaction. Paid rent for the month. Okay, natay renta for the month, which is 1,500. So, nagbayad ta. Sir, nakanong nakaingot ka nga nagbayad because of the word paid. Nagbayad ta og 1,500 para asa itong bayaran sa renta. Okay, this is now what you call an expense. Take note ha, expenses reduces our capital. So, since it reduces our capital, it should be debited. But instead of debiting our instead of debiting capital, you simply debit expenses. So atong expenses nadungagan debit. Right? Expense, credit, cash. How much? 1,000. 1,500. To record payment. Okay, next. Paid water and electricity, totaling 3,650. So, again, nagbayad na, napaday collected. Okay? Di ba in diri nga transaction, nag-render tag service. Pero wala ta bayari. So in this next transaction, nakakolekta daw ta. Okay? So since nakakolekta ta, our cash increased. Nadungagan atong kwarta. Pero what about our collectibles, our accounts receivable? Ang atong accounts receivable decreased kasi there is already a collection. Since na collection, nabawasan na ato ang collectible. So cash and then accounts receivable. Our cash increased, therefore it should be debited 3,000. Our accounts receivable, since this is an asset and then nabawasan siya, it should be credited to record collection of payment. Next, paid water and electricity expenses. So, pareha lang yapon yun niya sa renta. This is actually expenses. Water and electricity expenses. Okay? And the account that we usually use to record them ay utilities expense. Ginasagol lang natin ang usually. And then, nagbayad daw ta, cash. Therefore, 3,650. 3,650. Okay. Next, used to, alam mo ni, 2,500. 2,500 niya, dili na siya 25,000. Used 2,500 worth of supplies. Okay, nakagamit daw ta og supplies worth 2,500. Di ba naatay gipalit na supplies diri sa taas? Ayan, 3,000. Diri ako sa taas, 8,500. So this time daw, nagamit daw nato siya. So since nagamit nato siya, okay, since nagamit nato siya, in accounting, aside from the things nga ginabayaran nato para sa expenses, we also expense things nga makonsume nato. Okay? We also expense the things that we consume. And in this case, our supplies was used. Okay? Since nagamit nato siya, it forms part of our expenses. So, how do we record that one? We record them as supplies expense. Okay, so what is our credit? Since naggamit ta og supplies, we recorded it sa supplies expenses. Our existing supplies was reduced. Okay? Nadungagan ang atong supplies expense and then nabawasan ang atoang supplies. So, supplies is an asset and since nabawasan siya, dapat i-credit siya. So, supplies. Supplies expense, nadungagan, that's 2,500. And then, supplies, nabawasan, 2,500. Okay? I think this is quite a bit difficult or hard to understand kasi usually, kanina mga ingani nga transactions na ano na siya sa adjusting entry. But nevertheless, I hope I was able to explain it well. But if not, feel free to ask. Record. And then we are now in the last entry, transaction. This period salaries were 4,700 payable this month. Okay. So at the end of the month, naadaw tayo 4,700 nga sweldo nga bayro nun. We record this one because by the end of the month, kailangan na nato siya bayaran. Pero wala pa nato siya bayari. Okay? We just record it for the meantime. So salaries are expenses, salaries and wages. So we just debit. Since these are expenses, we debit it. There's an increase of salaries and wages expense. And since wala na to siya bayari, mahimo ni siyang utang. Usually use salaries payable. Okay? So ang atong utang sa sweldo na dungagan. Since this is an utang, it should be credited. 4,700. So if we total all of our debit and credit, hopefully we will arrive at an equal amount. Okay? Right, 2,550. So equal ang debit and credit. We have satisfied the second equation, which is debit should always be equal to credit. And then, if you notice, ang ato ang, diba, kaning aside, asset man ni diri ang aside, asset itanan. And diri ang aside kay liabilities and equity. Our first equation tells us that all assets should be equal to liability plus equity. Total assets recorded kay 157,350 and then diri 157,350. So both of them are equal. Okay? So let's just end there for the journal entries. I hope you were able to understand our discussion. And by next meeting, original class, by next meeting, we will be discussing posting the accounts and ledger. Okay? So if you wanted to get a copy of this reference, feel free to make a comment or reach me sa ako ang Facebook page. That would be all and see you next time. Nada. See you next time. Bye-bye.